Hey everybody, welcome to the first day of the challenge. Again, I'm so thrilled that you're here. Now, I want to start off by quickly giving an overview of leaky gut. Now, chances are you're in this challenge because you've heard of the term leaky gut before, but you aren't entirely clear on what it's about, and you're not really sure what kind of role it has in your Hashimoto's. So, the reason why a leaky gut is a problem in Hashimoto's is because it becomes a gateway for unwanted toxins, pathogens, and food particles to move through the gut wall and into the blood and trigger an immune response against your own tissue, like the thyroid. So sealing up that leaky gut is really important, but we must first understand what causes that leaky gut, right? The intestinal barrier, the gut wall, has the thickness of one single cell. It's very, very thin. It's a layer of these different epithelial cells, as they call them, and they release hormones and proteins, and they protect you from unwanted toxins and food particles and chemicals and infections, etc., from getting into the blood and triggering your immune system. Now, what you should know is that it's not a black or white thing. You either have a leaky gut or you don't. Everybody on this earth has some level of leakiness, whether you have an autoimmune disease or not. It's more of a gradient. It changes all the time, hour to hour, depending on exposures and lifestyle factors. So, for example, exercise does cause a leaky gut for a short period of time. Certain foods do that too. The gut can resolve and return back to normal, to its intact state quickly, usually, and other times it doesn't if it's constantly being penetrated. But this inherently isn't the problem. It's more about the total bucket burden. And if the bucket spills over, right, many things damage the gut lining, then there's health consequences. Then there's severe, persistent leaky gut, and that's an issue. And we know from research that a leaky gut is associated with a myriad of health issues like acne, eczema, psoriasis, IBS, brain fog, food intolerances, candida, celiac disease, chronic fatigue, ALS, autoimmune disease as a whole, even. So it's a pretty big deal. And so we're going to briefly go over some of the big hitters that I have found contributing to a leaky gut. So let's talk about food. So the question becomes then, what foods are causing my leaky gut? We do understand that healing a leaky gut is important to curb symptoms, get inflammation down, and to control Hashimoto's. But there are two things we need to keep in mind. There are foods that cause leaky gut, of course, but secondly, there are food sensitivities that can come from having a leaky gut. Maybe right now you're on a restrictive diet, you're on AIP, some elimination diet, and you may think that if you have a leaky gut and heal it, you will no longer have a food sensitivity issue. But that isn't always the case, actually. Food proteins can move into the liver and interact with immune cells down there and trigger inflammation, and that can also perpetuate the food sensitivity issues. So there's more involved with food sensitivities, but healing a leaky gut can certainly allow you to become more tolerable to foods over time. I just want to let you know about that. Nonetheless, we want to focus now on food triggers that penetrate the gut wall and the foods that can aggravate the immune system and thereby contribute to a leaky gut and cause more symptoms. So the number one offender when it comes to food, maybe you can guess, gluten. Yes, gluten. So gliadin is a kind of protein in gluten that can cause the release of zonulin, which is a protein in the gut wall that's spelled zonulin. And zonulin causes the loss of junction integrity, right? So the gut wall starts to break open. Even in people who don't have celiac disease or gluten sensitivities. That's why gluten can be a problem, but more so in people with Hashimoto's and autoimmune disease too, because it opens up the gates for things to pass through the gut wall and into the blood and trigger your immune system. And very rarely is anyone I find with Hashimoto's able to really tolerate gluten. But if you do run a test, it's important to understand that most food sensitivity tests screen for just one part of the gluten plant. So if you're negative for alpha-gliadin, it doesn't mean you are automatically able to tolerate gluten. You want to test for the other proteins to rule out gluten sensitivity. So you want to look for antibody responses towards wheat germ agglutinin, alpha-gliadin, gamma-gliadin, and omega-gliadin. Okay, so next up on the list, number 2 is nightshades. This is a category of foods that contain eggplants, white potato, bell peppers, paprika, red pepper flakes, and cayenne pepper. Now, nightshades are composed of 2 proteins, alkaloids and lectins. Okay, alkaloids and lectins. So these alkaloid proteins can flare up people with autoimmune disease if they have the right genes. Many people can have intolerances to nightshades because of the alkaloids. And these compounds simply bind to immune cells and promote inflammation. And this can happen despite having a negative food test against nightshades, ironically. So, in some people who have the right genetics, they will react negatively to these foods, but will not show up with antibodies on the test. But they feel better when they remove them from their diet. The issue with lectins in people who have the right genes is that lectins can bind to receptors on immune cells and trigger a very, very pro-inflammatory state. Now, lectins are basically the sticky part of the plant. So there's a term called agglutination, right? Agglutination. And that really means that lectins can stick with other proteins very easily in the body. So if that happens, it forms a new protein. And in people with the right genes, that triggers an unfavorable immune response. In truth, not everyone is reactive to lectins and nightshades. It really is a small percentage of the population, but you at least want to be aware of it and look into it potentially. Now, I'll tell you what, heating can inactivate lectins and help you tolerate lectins. But sometimes there may not be complete inactivation, so you'll have to do a bit of experimentation with it. But bear in mind that some people can eat these foods if they heat them up, but you may not be able to handle it. And if you can't, then you're better off just removing them from your diet. Now, of course, there are other foods that can contribute to a leaky gut, and that would be casein. That's a protein in dairy. Food colorings actually can as well. Too much sugar, of course, in the diet. Food additives, alcohol, protein powders, surprisingly, even if it's plant-based and animal-free. It's not a good idea. And the reason why is because it's basically hydrolyzed protein. It's very small particles of protein. And that can be really triggering for the immune system and breed more inflammation. So you want to pay attention to that and be aware of that if you are not used to consuming protein powder and you decide to one day. So like I said earlier, I find that people who are dealing with a leaky gut are having more food sensitivities. And as a result of that, they're on restrictive diets like paleo or AIP, for example. And I find that they're eating a lot of the same foods every single day. So I want to share with you a quick client case study about this and why this was a problem. So I had a client not too long ago, and her name was Katie. She was somebody who was on a restricted diet for a long time, like many years. She had done paleo, keto, Whole30, and eventually she ended up on AIP. I mean, she was literally eating the same foods every day. Chicken and kale and broccoli and berries and carrots, and like that's about it. She didn't have a social life. She didn't want to go out. She was afraid of going out because she was fearful of there being cross-contamination, like gluten getting into her food if she's at a restaurant. So she was always on high alert, always worried about what might happen. Has that ever happened to you? It's pretty miserable, right? And she felt totally miserable. And not to mention, she would react to lectins and nightshades and gluten-free grains even. But I knew that this was not a permanent diet issue for her. And I told her that it was not sustainable either, nor necessary for life. And we did this by first eliminating the food triggers that were aggravating her immune system. Then we supported her leaky gut and microbiome. We encouraged more diversity in her food. We implemented strategies to slow down her immune system also. And honestly, within a good 16 weeks or so, she was a whole different person. I mean, she was able to expand her diet. She was able to get off AIP. She lost weight for the first time in 5 years and has been able to keep it off since then. Pretty amazing, right? So overall, what I'm trying to say here is that healing your leaky gut promotes the ability to have a reduction in your symptoms, and it allows you to have more diversity in your food. You're able to expand your diet and enjoy your social life. That's what we all want, right? Okay, so here are your action steps. Number 1, gluten and dairy are probably the biggest gut offenders, and removing them is generally advised. If you haven't done a food test That's fine. You can do it later, but in the meantime, at least get rid of gluten and dairy for now, if you're not doing that already. Number 2, well, figure out what foods are causing this immune reaction. And we'll talk more about this in tomorrow's video, but you can at least pay attention more to your symptoms and see if there's any sort of correlation. Number 3, your next goal is to reassess and see if it's worth revisiting what you're eating and making sure you're fully eliminating any foods that are not serving you, like excess sugar, food additives, alcohol, protein powders like we talked about, and obviously hidden gluten that can be found in foods like oats. And lastly, see how long you've been eating the same foods every single day. Is it time to rotate and try something different for once? Right? Like eating fish instead of chicken, or kale instead of broccoli, bananas instead of berries, right? Change it up. Food diversity is very important for your gut health and microbiome. I actually speak much more about this in depth inside the Hashimoto's Academy, which you can check out if you want to learn more about finding the right diet for yourself, how to eat more foods again, and stop your immune system from attacking your thyroid. So if you want to check that out, please click the link below this video to learn more about it. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow.